I am the CEO of the Texas Tribune. How many of you read the Texas Tribune or know about the Texas Tribune? Excellent. Just for those that do not know, I'm going to put it out there. We are a nonprofit news organization, statewide news organization in Texas, the largest nonprofit statewide news organization in Texas. And if you haven't been reading us, it is free. So please do read about what is happening in our state on a regular basis. And if you want to know what's happening, it's a good place to start. With that, we're going to have an exciting conversation today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let me just give a little bit of overview, and then we'll go right into questions. And I'm going to quickly introduce my panelists. We have Randi Weingarten, who may come in late, and if she does come in, we will go ahead and just incorporate her into the conversation as it comes in. But to my left, Zeph Capo is the current president of Texas American Federation of Teachers, AFT, and previously he was the president of Houston Federation of Teachers. Next to him is Jessica Campos. She is a dedicated HISD parent and a Denver Harbor community advocate. She's committed to educational equity and community engagement. She has 3 daughters in HISD and has gone beyond typical parental roles. Before the state takeover, she started a Girl Scout troop, organized several beautification projects, and created a garden for the elderly in her community. She has also served as PTO president, soccer coach, and supported health education through Girls on the Run. You are busy. And then next to her is Josh Cowen. He is a professor of education policy at Michigan State University and an author on topics related to education politics, school choice, and culture wars in the United States. In addition to all of the major academic outlets in his research field, his book, The Privatize, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers, will be released this September. Well, that is a very apt topic for what we need to discuss both in Texas, but also, I think, across the nation. So let me just give some facts here. According to USA Today, Politico, super PACs, political action committees are pouring, especially right-wing super PACs, are pouring significant amounts of political dollars into state legislative races across the country to push a far more right education agenda. They are not just focused on legislative races, but also on local school board races, and it's having an impact nationally. These PACs are calling it a parents' right agenda. Last year, Project 1776, one of these super PACs, raised $4.3 million and spent $3.1 million. In 2022, they raised $3.4 million and spent $3.1 million. In just Texas alone, the Club for Growth spent $4 million on the legislative races here. Let me put that into context and what that means. All of the teachers' unions PACs in 2021-2022 raised $4 million across the country. So just a sense of how money is being spent in the state and across our nation. Much of the money of these super PACs are coming from far-right donors and have been focused on using public dollars for vouchers, school choice, and especially focused on issues of race and identity. According to the Post, the voucher programs, largely popular with conservatives, are rapidly growing in GOP-run states, with a total of 29 states plus DC operating some sort of voucher system. And Josh, I know we'll go into some of this. 8 states have created or expanded voucher programs last year, including Alabama, Georgia, and Missouri, and have approved or expanded voucher type programs in many other states. And then there are some states that also have universal voucher programs, which we will talk about. Nationally, reports show that states that have approved voucher programs, the largest recipient of state dollars have been religious schools. So far, Texas has resisted vouchers, but there are other policies on charter expansion, state takeovers of school districts, and curriculum, which the state is taking a more active role in our local schools, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. As many of you know, education spending is largely a local and state issue. According to the Urban Institute, the federal government provides only 11% of funding for primary and secondary education. That's about $88 billion. States provides 46%, which is about $384 billion of the funding, and local governments provide 44%, which is about $365 billion of funding. So this is a topic that's so important at this convention for educators, and you all have a voice on this issue in Texas and nationwide. And there are real solutions that are needed for public education. And we're going to dig into some of these today and really think through what are the issues, and then what can we do about it, and how can we think about that. So with that, Zeph, I'm going to start with you. And the 4 topics I hope to cover, if we have time to do it, are education post-COVID, privatization, vouchers, and school takeovers, curriculum and culture wars, and really then what are solutions that we should be looking at. So let me start with COVID. After COVID, we all know that K through 12 schools were significantly disrupted during COVID-19. In Texas, the 2021 STAR results showed that only 35% of all students met grade level in math, compared to 50% in 2019. We've written about it at the Texas Tribune. In Texas, the state mandated more tutoring as one of the solutions. What is being done, and what are we seeing post-COVID now, and what has happened since then?
So I think everyone can recognize that education was disrupted during a worldwide pandemic. And we probably wouldn't expect any less. It wasn't just education. Almost every institution and system that we have and rely on was deeply impacted by this worldwide pandemic. When it comes to education, and we can talk about some of the responses to it afterwards, but what we've known, what we've consistently have research in, is to show that test scores, the greatest indicator, the thing that you can learn most about test scores, is an indicator of the financial position of those students. What has been invested into their education. And particularly for Texas, what most parents, what most people in our general society don't really know is the very first year in 20 and 21, we spent probably the first 6 to 8 months actually fighting the state to release the emergency COVID dollars that were provided by the federal government. Because we knew that funding issue, we knew that the changes that they were having to make and how they were going to buy the additional equipment, move to this new operation, was going to have a deep impact. So I don't think that there's been enough to kind of disaggregate what that impact is, because we know, we have deep research that funding issue is a major driver of test scores. That's the best thing it's going to tell us. Coming out of, and once we finally were able to get dollars released so that school districts could make emergency decisions, what most of them ended up doing, and they get criticized for it on the back end, is using those dollars for extra staff, new individuals, the tutoring and the other pieces that came in there, which they tried to tell them not to necessarily use, but they didn't have much of a choice. If you're being held accountable in a certain way and you're trying to make up for these particular pieces, and computer-aided schooling is not necessarily working, which, you know, it boggles my mind that our state legislature can say that on one time and then throws fits whenever we don't pass their boondoggle bills to aid virtual schooling. There's some incongruence there. They spent those dollars trying to get more people in, trying to respond to these particular issues in a way, because they have not had an increase at the state level. So you start with a state that's trying to supplant the dollars that they're actually putting in 20 and 21 by substituting with the federal dollars. And then as you go through the first 2 years afterwards, you've not had the additional state funding, so they're almost using the COVID dollars to backfill what the state should have been doing. So part of what we were doing, part of our issue was we've not been keeping up with, for the last 5 years, the investment that our kids needed to make the changes permanent, to make sure there was the additional staffing, to do the additional timepieces that were going to be required and necessary to make up this difference. So I think that those things are hard to separate, and the COVID learning loss has become a real excuse to pull people away from, or to not talk about the fact that the state has not for a very long time done what it should be doing to make education whole.
How long did it take the state to release the COVID dollars?
I think we were almost halfway through the second semester of the year before we were actually able to get those dollars released. School districts, again, just as they have been this year, going into negative balances and using their reserve funds to be able to make ends meet, they were actually having to do the same thing as well. For that first 6 to 8 months of schooling, they were actually deficit spending to try to get all the things in that were needed, and with simply a hope and a prayer that the state would finally provide them the dollars that the federal government had allocated for them to use.
And where today, you know, post-COVID, and those dollars are also starting to run out, where today are teachers and schools feeling the punch in terms of like what's happening as those dollars are coming down? The state hasn't released the dollars yet. What does that mean for learning loss?
It's huge. It's also meant tremendous increase in turnover of our staff. Experienced educators are leaving at an alarming rate. The answer to the teacher shortage has been to fill classrooms with people that don't have experience, do not have any education. They call them apprentices, but then they don't actually have a qualified mentor to truly be able to work with them in the way that they need. And this is not new. We've done this before. Our state government and governments across the country have responded to a massive teacher crisis with lowering the standards, and it always results in a dramatic overtime downtick in accountability, and they wonder why. That is never the answer. Lowering our standards should never be the answer to how we solve these issues. What we should be doing is making sure teachers in Corpus Christi, for example, don't have an inflation-adjusted salary that's 20% lower than it was 10 years ago. That's not a way to keep people in the classroom because they can't feed their own families.
Yeah. Jessica, the long-term isolation in the pandemic put emotional stress on students and families. And one study from Texas A&M surveyed 2,000 high school students and found that 71% were experiencing heightened levels of stress and anxiety due to the pandemic. Are you continuing to see these levels of anxiety, especially for your children, but across this, I know you work closely with the schools, and as parents, what are you seeing?
Well, definitely, I mean, after the pandemic, there was a lot of, issues because we were coming out of the pandemic. And for us, we have a lot of ADHDers in our home. I even have ADHD, and it was difficult. We had just had a baby. We had the dogs and the rooster next door that caused a lot of distractions. And so coming back to school was very difficult, not only for myself and my children, but I mean, we also lost family members. We lost jobs. Coming back was stressful for parents just as much as it was for children. We had a wraparound specialist, though, and that was very helpful. And now I'm seeing even more stress on my children and actually depression. A lot of mental issues are coming out of this new education system that's been implemented in our school district. So yeah, definitely, it's been a stressful time since pandemic for all of us. And removing the wraparound specialist has not been helpful for us either.
And we'll come back to what's happening with HISD in just a minute, because I do think this is an important piece. And Josh, on one hand, schools don't have enough money to pay teachers or maintain schools. On the other hand, school closures and performance, especially post-COVID, have given proponents of privatization even more leverage. Tell us what is happening.
Yeah, so first of all, just thank you for having me here. I think I'm the one non-Texan here, at least on the panel, so just really appreciate the invitation to come speak today. Betsy DeVos, Charles Koch, Jeff Yass, billionaire in Pennsylvania, just gave $10 million, $6 million, and then another $4 million to Governor Abbott, have been pushing for school vouchers and other forms of privatization for a long time before COVID. And we can acknowledge that this once-in-a-generation pandemic had devastating impacts across the board. We've talked about that already. And at the same time, say forcefully that privatization vouchers are not the answer, whatever else the answer is. It's not cynical, it's just simply realistic to know that this voucher push started before COVID. It'll continue once the ESSER dollars are all gone, once the pandemic is a distant but long-lasting and persistent memory. One thing I wanted to kind of say from the outset, just while we're talking about the pandemic, learning loss, and money, and how vouchers sort of tie into all of that, what's really important to understand, and I'm going to be saying this repeatedly in session after session that I've been invited to over the next few days, but I'm going to start here. If we're going to talk about test scores, and I would second Zeph's warning about what test scores measure, but if we're going to talk about them, they are the coin of the realm in all the states for how we kind of judge public schools. Just on that measure, over the last decade, vouchers have caused steeper learning loss in the states where they've been implemented, up to and including twice as large as what COVID-19 did just next door in Louisiana.
Repeat that statement.
Vouchers have caused up to and including twice what the pandemic itself did to test scores, if we're just talking about test scores. So whatever else they are, and they are a right-wing billionaire push, and they are a push to privatize education in this country, but what they are not is a solution to the COVID-specific learning loss, because they have had far worse effects on test scores in states that have actually allowed the results to be measured.
Let's dig into a little bit on the vouchers piece. Give us an explanation, just a definition of what are these vouchers, and what, I know there's multiple types, but I think it's good for us to just know what we're talking about.
So when we're talking about vouchers, we're talking about taxpayer funding for private school tuition. The other side, right-wing advocates for these things, think tanks, will call it school choice broadly. Well, there's already school choice in Texas. There's school choice in my state, Michigan. There are charter schools. There's inter-district choice between different schools. When we're talking about vouchers, what we're really talking about is taxpayer funding for private school tuition. So just definitionally. When Project 2025, if you've heard of this kind of big blueprint for a Donald Trump presidency written by the Heritage Foundation, when Project 2025 calls for universal school choice, what they mean is universal taxpayer funding for private school tuition. And what happens when vouchers come to town is it's not even really about school choice at all, because schools get to pick their kids. Those private schools get to pick their kids. All the states that you sort of mentioned at the top that have passed vouchers in the last 2 or 3 years, none of the legislation contains any provisions like it used to in some states in the old days when I first started working on this stuff, that said schools have to take kids who apply if they're going to get taxpayer funding. Now it's the school's choice. It's not school choice for kids and families. 3/4 of voucher users in the states that have passed vouchers so far were already in private school before taxpayers picked up the dime for that tuition. The other quarter, about 25% or so, who do transfer out of public schools, those are the kids that we see that horrific learning loss for, because we can see how they were doing in the public school, and we can see what happens to them, or at least we were able to see over the last decade. All that new legislation contains no ability to look under the hood and see how these kiddos are doing, because these folks see the same results that I do, and they don't want to risk any more headlines that have occurred over the last decade about how bad these results are.
So if states are funding private schools, do they have to provide the same information to the government as public schools do?
No.
So how do we judge whether this is even working?
Well, I'll let the other side make their case, but in brief what they say is as long as parents are happy, the school's doing fine. And my point has been, as long as we are going to be using taxpayer funding to whatever, whether it's for voucher schools, whether it's for public schools, they need to be on the same page.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're not
we
even
can-
playing the same rules of the game.
We can have the debate about test scores, but as long as public schools have to take test scores, we need to be asking the voucher schools to do the exact same thing.
Zeph, before we go into talk about the voucher program here in Texas, let's talk about the 2023 TEA takeover of HISD. TEA took over HISD, installed Mike Miles as the new superintendent. In his time at HISD, Miles has turned school libraries into detention centers, laid off autism service teams in special education classrooms, mandated that classrooms stay open, raising concerns about safety. The HISD takeover has not only been controversial, but has certainly taken power from local officials. Give us some background on what caused this takeover, and then how do we know anything is working? And Jessica, we'll come back to this.
So to be fair, I think this was a solution looking for an excuse to implement. I do not think it's a large leap, because HISD is not the only major institution in the Houston-Harris County area that the state has targeted. They've targeted the county, they've targeted others, particularly with a focus on suppressing and depressing democratic voice in our community. And I think that there's a very significant reason why that's taking place. If you have a county and a city like Harris County, where we have more population than 22 other states, and the potential to basically erase them from power if people in this community actually voted at the same rates as people in other states. You want to control those levers of power that would allow people to move to a place where they become the civically responsible individuals that they need to. And I think that they've seen over the last 10 years or more, our young people are waking up, our young people are paying attention, our young people have an interest in what's happening in their world and in their society. And if you're able to control, if you are able to do what has been done under the excuse of test scores, under the excuse of improper board management, because let me tell you, a lot of those excuses, I'm going to be honest, as a Houstonian, I was embarrassed about some of the things. The people who are in this room, the things that came out of our board table that were in public, we were all embarrassed by it. But when I got into the position of having to look across the state, not just in Democratic communities, but in Republican communities, in small districts, in large districts, those behaviors aren't any different. There's not an even-keeled stick about what we're looking at. The fact that one school could be the reason that a district as large as HISD gets taken over, because we've seen this in the small rules as well too. This is a power grab. This is about the state instituting their own plans about how plans move forward. When you talk about closing libraries, when you talk about the things that were mentioned, what you're talking about is removing the humanity from students. And if they don't have that basic human values that, in my opinion, are so much more important than any test score, then how are they going to be able to take the mantle, participate in our democratic voice and our democratic process? This is far bigger reaching than just each of the schools in the school district passing based on this random test score number that, despite what the commissioner said, has changed consistently almost year after year, where they've had to chase a moving target.
One could argue that the test scores have improved in those schools. How do you approach that question?
Excellent question, and I have not had a chance to do the deep dive. Maybe somebody from one of our university institutions can help us look at that. But as a former science teacher who taught biology, when I started looking at the raw data, for example, that was one of the areas where they were talking about doing so well. The first question that came to mind to me was, why are so fewer students taking the actual exam this year than has ever been the norm and the average from previous years? And what was going on and how was that set up? And because the raw numbers looked like there were significant deviations from the norm. So are these scores authentic? Are students in fact doing better? Or are they doing what every educator that has been in schools around for a very long time has seen, is data is consistently manipulated to make it look as well as it can? I think that there's there needs to be a deeper dive into these scores before we say that it's actually working.
Jessica, you have 3 kids in HISD
Right.
schools. How are you experiencing the takeover?
So, just to let you know, the STAR scores didn't go up in all schools because at Pew Elementary, it was an A-rated school. Our scores went down. Also, if you look into the Spanish STAR takers, their scores also went significantly down. So, I think that we need to really pay attention to why the scores are higher in some of the areas that he's showing. But I agree, less students did test in several areas. But the takeover for us at Pew Elementary has been horrible. We've lost value in our school. Pew Elementary was an A-rated school. We are a 99% Latino school, 99% economically disadvantaged. And we had a wonderful NASA robotics program. We had a nature awareness program. We had Urban Harvest. We had a PTO. We had a wonderful school community, and it has been torn apart. Parents are not allowed to have communication with the teachers. We lost our library. I know that the superintendent likes to gaslight us and say, no, there's plenty of books. Look, we're in a library. We've been gaslighted so much this year. Parents are not allowed on campus anymore. I used to be the go-to mom, and this year teachers were told not to speak to me. I cried the first time a teacher spoke to me at the end of the school year because she had already been let go, so she had nothing to lose, and she was like, please help me. I've tried my best to inform our community, because the first thing that I noticed was there was a lack of information for our Spanish-speaking community. The Facebook page is never updated. Even when we would go to the meetings, let me start by saying we lost all of our bilingual teachers and our bilingual principal. Every year we've had a bilingual teacher, and principal, because our community is Spanish speaking. Every parent is Spanish speaking, so our meetings were always in Spanish, but we lost that. So we have no communication now, no communication, not even with our principal, no communication with teachers. We're not being told when the teachers are changed. We have uncertified teachers now. I went as far as to apply to see how far I could get, and I'm sorry, but I'm not a high school graduate. I don't even have a GED, and I got a job working for HISD as a dyad teacher. I would be learning with the students. I could not take that responsibility on. It was just to see how far I could get, but I don't want that for my students. I want the NASA robotics program back. I want the nature awareness program back. I want those things back in our school, and we've lost all of that.
So just to put it in context, before the takeover, you were involved in the school.
Yes, ma'am.
And the teachers were reaching out to you.
Sure.
So give us a little bit of what was it before, and because you sort of gave us a little bit of the after, so we have a comparison.
So when we came back from the pandemic, I had one child that went to, I did take advantage of school choice, and I placed her at Meyerland, MPVA. And I became part of the PTO there. And I noticed quickly that at Pew Elementary we didn't have a PTO. And I learned so much from the PTO at Meyerland that I decided I wanted to do the same thing in our community. Every time Meyerland had a beautification day, I organized one at Pew Elementary as well. If we started a garden at Meyerland, we started a garden at Pew, because I noticed that there were things at Meyerland that we didn't have in our community, and I wanted that for our community because I felt like we needed it. There was a time where I didn't have a twin-size bed for my child. We were just coming out of the pandemic, didn't have a job. My child was saying that the springs were coming out of the bed. I reached out to the wraparound specialist at Pew Elementary, and she told me that they could not help me. I reached out to the MPVA specialist, and I got 2 twin-size beds, mattress and all. And they invited me to come to their wraparound room, and I walked in, and I saw basically a Walmart. I mean, they had dog food, food, clothes, shoes, uniforms, household items, everything that you could possibly, that we need in our communities. This community had everything, and I wanted to know how, why, if we're a Title I school and supposedly there's more, funds that go to these type of schools, why don't we have what Meyerland has? So I quickly, saw the difference in our communities, and I think that there's a big gap in equity. And when Mike Miles kept bringing up equity at these community meetings, I immediately realized that we're not getting equity, because this guy came into our community saying that we needed bikes, we needed exercise bikes, when we actually needed working AC. We needed more resources for our teachers. Our teachers used to buy things with using their own money to have creative learning with our kids.
Jessica, was there a consultation with parents
Never.
when the takeover happened?
Never. And I think that's what made us the most angry, because you can't provide equity unless you come into a community and speak to us to see what we need, because every community is different.
Yeah. And now I believe, Zeph, that HISD is doing a bond offering, one of the largest bond offerings in the state. I believe HISD had asked for this before, and why was it rejected, and why are now both AFT and parents opposing this bond offering?
So I think to kind of build on what Jessica was talking about, there's been various stages in this takeover. Clearly, there were equity issues in HISD before the takeover that needed to be worked on and were constantly brought to the forefront. But there was opportunity for parents like Jessica across the district to have voice and try to make those changes. What we've seen was schools like Jessica's, and I'm very familiar with Denver Harbor, I worked there for many years, were the first to be targeted because they were seen, I think, by the superintendent as the easiest to take away voice, while the rest of the community, particularly folks like in Meyerland, where Jessica mentioned, were basically told their schools were going to be left alone. This last year, that has all changed. Now that there has been a complete dismantling of a significant part of the district, it's taking on the rest of the district that is been able to more fight back because they're more well-heeled, they have resources, and what it's actually created in some ways is a bit of cohesion between parents and communities across the district. So when you're in school board meetings, you find parents that may live on the east end, the west end, no matter where, every one of them also are ending their comments to the board with the term, no trust, no bond. Because there has been a fundamental, not just stripping of voice, but stripping of any idea of trust and any level of belief that as a parent or as a teacher, you could have some actual impact on the direction of your child. And when you take those fundamental rights to voice for parents, where this is going to be the most important thing they do is helping their kids get through school, you erode trust to a point where why would we want to give you $4 billion of our money? You haven't earned it. And until he can earn it, I think this community is going to continue to say no. And people are willing to make sacrifices. Just like the voucher issue in this last legislative session, our teachers, because we asked them multiple times, they sacrificed their own raise because they knew that the vouchers were going to hurt their communities, and usually our communities that are most at risk and have the least infrastructure. It's the same thing now with parents. Parents know that our schools have their air conditioners improved, like kids and teachers coming back in the month of August and into September with no air conditioning, 100 degrees in their buildings. They know that there's a need, but until there's a fundamental reckoning that builds back that trust, allows them to have some voice, and frankly, brings humanity back to education in HISD, I think that they're going to continue to say no.
Okay, so you brought up the voucher bill. A bipartisan coalition of Texas lawmakers defeated the voucher bill in 2023. Governor Abbott targeted a number of these anti-voucher Republicans and ousted 9 of them. What do we expect in this legislative session?
I think it's going to be really tough. It's going to be a hard-fought legislature. We thought it was bad last time. It's going to be rougher this time. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think the full story has been told. When you look back at these elections, people like Jeff Yass and others, I think we stopped counting when we were able to identify, I think it was close to $40 million or more from outside money that were poured into Texas elections to basically bully Republican legislators in his own party that were actually voting for their districts. They knew damn well that there was not one single private school there where you could actually use a voucher in their entire district, but they were targeted. And when you look back at what was used to target them, very little discussion was actually on public education. They were targeted around immigration issues. They were targeted around topics that had nothing to do with schooling. So, they knew, even the governor, even his billionaires knew that a voucher program was not really a selling point that was moving people to vote. And if and when they pass it, and we will go down swinging to keep that from happening, if and when they pass it, and when people start to realize it, when it truly does start to impact Friday Night Lights in Texas, I feel that there will be a reckoning.
And it held up school funding, if I'm not wrong. So teachers were willing to fight that. Josh, 8 states have adopted the universal voucher program in 2023. In light of new cost estimates that show Arizona's universal voucher program is costing the state close to $1 billion per year, how is this affecting? What are public schools in different states doing, and what is an argument here for Texas?
Yeah, so let me just put a bookmark on the last conversation we just had about the takeover, and whether or not it was working, and what the metrics are and stuff like that, just before I jump into this really, really important question. And I want everybody to remember something when this issue and these promises come up in the fall and in the spring, whatever happens with the voucher bill, about how it's going to work and how it's going to give kids a lifeline from so-called failing schools, and it's going to give parents a choice. The entire reason that we are able to sit here in this panel and talk about whether or not the takeover is or isn't working is because the public schools affected by the takeover have to take these tests, they have to put performance metrics out, and the superintendent runs around and talks about his plan. If they were as confident in the vouchers having some sort of positive effect as they are apparently, from what I hear from you all about the success of this Houston takeover, they'd be pushing for similar metrics and similar bragging rights about the vouchers bills. But they know that over the last decade, again, we've seen some of the worst academic results on any type of reform, whether it's takeovers, whether it's certain curricular failures and things like that. So it's really important to remember that when it comes to vouchers, the promises there stop at the show me the money piece. They don't want to be held accountable for those results. So getting to the money piece itself. I mentioned a second ago that roughly 3/4 of voucher users are already in private school to begin with when these voucher schemes pass the legislatures. That sort of counterintuitively is how the defunding of the public school system starts. It is true that some districts will lose a few kiddos to go to the districts that have private schools in them, right? Will lose a handful of children. And for those districts, that can be an enormous cost. Depending on the size of the district, even losing 15 or 20 kids, you still got to pay the bills. You still got to find maintenance of the buses. You still have, So that is a loss. But the really big thing, the really big threat, and this is how the rural communities suffer, even if they don't have any private schools for the voucher kids to go to, is at the state level when the state commits itself to paying the tuition for kids who are already in there. So the Arizona dollars that you mentioned, Arizona, Florida, and Ohio, those 3 states, next year will all top over $1 billion each in voucher payments, mostly to children who are already in private schools. You think budget fights are hard now? Right? And I know they are. And I know a lot of the people in this room and a lot of the people listening to me have sweated and bled over those budget fights. You think those budget fights are hard now, though? Just wait till $1 billion is already committed in the budget to taxpayer funds for tuition. That's where you start to really feel the dollars declining. 6 of the last 7 states to pass vouchers over the last few years failed to keep up with the national average in per pupil spending allowances. And the 7th, the one that did, Ohio, is about to go into the red simply because they've expanded their voucher program to universal status. So what's happening is these states are obligating themselves to costs that were previously borne by the private schools and by the private school parents.
Given all of these numbers, how are states continuing to justify that this is okay?
Well, the short-term plan is to sort of deny the reality of it. So you have the Texas Public Policy Foundation here, which literally exists to push out right-wing policies. But they have sister organizations or brother organizations, whatever you want to call them in other states. The Arizona one's called the Goldwater Institute. My state is called the Mackinac Institute. They're all affiliated. They all share the same reports. And right now, they're just simply saying, no, it's not happening. The Arizona dollars are not bankrupting the state. They're not going overwhelmingly to wealthy families who are already in private school. They're just simply saying, no, you guys are wrong. That's fake news. I mean, they're taking a page from Trump, honestly. In the long run, they're not going to be able to say that, right? And so we don't know how that's going to work, except to say, take Project 2025 at its word. Take Betsy DeVos at her word when she says that it's a shame that public schools are the centers of communities. She wants churches to go back to being the center of communities in her telling. Take them at their word. This is about defunding public schools. You can't pay for 2 education sectors over the long run. In the short run, you can make the dollars work, but not after. It usually takes about 3 or 4 budget cycles for the check to come due.
Zach, what does this mean for teachers? I mean, how are teachers maintaining having to implement all of the things that they're being told to do and not get funding and increasing number of students?
Well, look, danger of being called hyperbolic. I think that there's a segment of that right-wing kind of group that Josh is talking about that really wants to put the culture issues at the center rather than the actual purpose that public schools were set up for, which was really to bring us as a country together, to fight against separate communities and make sure that we were all one American society. They would just assume have us back in their attics and teaching Latin and grammar to their children and the skills necessary to make it back into factory world to everybody else's, or whatever that version of work is today. What it means to teachers is a fundamental deprofessionalization of their work. What it means is the last vestiges, the last steps of turning them into professionals, from professionals into hourly wage workers, into individuals that frankly do not have a path forward in their career, because we are already at the point where they have 20% in some cases more loss of their economic power to actually feed their own families. What it's meant is people are making decisions with their feet to go elsewhere, and it's fundamentally a shame. It's breaking our profession, and I think that that's part of its intent.
I mean, the Charles Butt Foundation did a survey last year, and they found that almost 68% of teachers surveyed were seriously considering leaving the profession. What does that mean for students?
It is extreme danger for students. You know, and that statistic, that's one that we've done ourselves. That's one that's been repeated elsewhere. That as teachers that are highly skilled, they have the type of soft skills on top of their academic learning that make them fantastic members of teams. The type of work that we do in so many industries today, and as they identify those opportunities, they're leaving, and they're not being refilled with individuals that have those skills. As a matter of fact, the state elsewhere, no one, they're not. Kind of as Jessica alluded to, as if you've got a pulse and you can get through the paperwork, we'll put you in. Now, and this is almost deja vu. We had this issue. If you look back to the Mark White days in the state of Texas, if you look back to the basically testing that they did of actual teachers to see that they're in this grade, that was a result of too many in our profession, rightly, probably not meeting the level and the standard that I think we as a profession would want and would have set, but it was the response to the policies and practices that were put in place by previous administrations responding to a teacher shortage. It's they have not learned a damn thing. They keep making the same mistakes that we've seen them make over decades, and we go through this cycle back and forth. 10 years from now, we'll be back to the teacher wars again, and it's all the teachers' fault that schools are breaking down, and no one will take responsibility for the fact that, as you said, dyad teachers and apprentice teachers and others that don't have that fundamental that background, and students are going to suffer. There is no doubt about it because of that. It's our job as a union, it's our job once they're in our profession to do our very best to try to help them to build those skills in, because that's the only thing we can do at that particular point. And you know, I'm sure somebody will say, well, we're just trying to protect the bad teacher again, but we're the ones that actually see these teachers that we know are underprepared being basically handed keys and a roll book, and you know, you're responsible for 30 kids and 30 lives now, and the only ones that really and truly are stepping up with them are their colleagues across the hall, the folks that have been through and done this before to try to make things better. That's why teacher voices need to be fundamentally at the table. That's why they should have more autonomy over their profession, just like we do with doctors and lawyers and others. The people that do that work all day, and the people that are willing to hold themselves to that high standard, and hold others to it as well too, but also know that you have to train them, you have to support them, and you have to be there with them as much as you can.
Jessica, I see you nodding along the way here. Where are you as a parent?
Oh, we need teachers, right? Students, this rotating door of teachers right now it's not good for our students, especially for students like the ones in my community. Me being a troop leader of our Girl Scout troop, I found that many of the girls that went to Pew Elementary had major problems at home. Some had issues like homelessness. Some of them had issues like both parents are incarcerated. I had girls with big, real problems, and they would call me mom. And sometimes these kids go to school, and school is probably the only place where they're going to receive some positive interactions. And removing the people that are most important to them, and these teachers that we had, our students were important to them. You know, the teachers that were at Pew Elementary were some of the lowest paid in the district. So they related with our communities. I had teachers that would go to our baseball games. I had teachers that knew all of the students of the school first and last name. So I like to put it this way. Have you ever gone to get your hair cut at the school of haircuts? Or gone to get your tooth pulled at the school of dentistry? Most people would not. I have had to do that because that's what I could afford. But the reason most people don't go is because they might mess you up, right? So right now we're sending our kids to school where it's the school of teachers. where they might mess up our kids. We don't know, because they're learning with our kids. I think that there was one instant where my daughter came home. She said, "Mom, I'm having such a hard time focusing when the principal walks in to teach the teacher how to teach us." That's a big distraction. I don't think that our children are getting the quality education that they deserve from certified teachers. So it's just a slap in the face when you say that you're here to help and improve our district, but you're taking away the most qualified teachers and removing books from our schools. So it's hard to say that you are actually here. What is your real intent? What are you really here for? And yes, we need qualified teachers, certified teachers in our schools.
Josh, what are you seeing in other states? What's happening with teachers, especially with the there's a nationwide teacher shortage, but what's happening with the voucher programs?
Well, the teacher shortage is real, but it's not the same everywhere. And what we know is that the shortage areas are most acute in traditionally underserved areas, areas that have generally serve lower income families. We have huge shortage areas in subjects that have teachers specializing in, for example, different kinds of learning disabilities. We don't have a lot of shortage areas, although they're starting to grow in really, really wealthy suburbs yet. And part of the reason for that is that they're very well resourced. So, shocker, when you're able to pay top dollar and you're able to invest in buildings that are nice places to work and nice places to go to school in, you're able to pay teachers well more than a living wage, but a professional wage. You don't have shortage areas in those places. It's the areas that are chronically underfunded, chronically underinvested in, that have these really acute shortage areas. I teach in a school of education, so sort of my professional community's day job, we are first and foremost a school that trains educators. And I've seen curriculum fads come and go. I've seen different training modules come and go, some very effective, some less so. I've seen different professional certification systems come and go. Over the last 10 years, and by the way, the same last 10 years that we've seen this catastrophic academic evidence for vouchers, over the last 10 years, the professional research community has shown without question, time and time and time again, to the point where it's not even a question anymore, that the single best way to improve student outcomes, to reduce teacher turnover, to reduce, to improve graduation rates, to improve income of the kids who are in those districts later in life, to reduce crime rates in those communities, the single best way to do all of those things at once isn't a magic curriculum. It isn't even necessarily a brand new building. It isn't a special degree. It's just deep and sustained investments in the public schools in those communities. Money matters. You get what you pay for. And when I go and talk about sort of the threats to vouchers, and I'm always asked, what's the alternative, Josh? What's your solution? What I say, first and foremost, is you get what you pay for. You have to invest in these schools and in these communities. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also the correct thing to do. If you believe anything that research has to say about anything, it confirms over and over and over and over and over again over the last few years that money matters. So any conversation, whether we're talking about teacher shortages, whether we're talking about test scores, whether we're talking about graduation rates, has to start with, again, deep and sustained investments in those public school communities. Otherwise, all the rest of it is just hypothetical.
Zeph, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could add into that, I completely agree with what Josh is saying. And it's evident that the other sides actually know that as well, too. They go out of their way with these other ideas and models and shiny baubles to draw our attention away from that fact. These disruptors, superintendents like Miles that come in, Greer before him and others, there may be some of the things that get done. I mean, if you do some drastic things and disrupt, you may be able to change some scores for a minute. But it's not the first time that we've gone through these. And just as soon as those those systems that are put in place that are not sustainable fall to the wayside, it's not actually real. You see that it's not true learning, because if you truly are learning, it's not things that you're going to forget. You learn how to ride a bike. You're not losing all of that in that same way. The disruption is actually the opposite thing that our schools need. They need structure, they need sustainability, they need the funding, they need policies that allow a teacher not only to have enough salary that they want to stay in that school, but then have a school leader who knows this person needs to be in this grade level working with this band of kids, not just for a year and then move them somewhere else. They need 2 or 3 years before they actually get really good at teaching the second grade curriculum. And that's one of the things that we consistently miss. So you have chronic underfunding on one side, and those schools are often the ones that are most hit with this massive disruption and disruptor policy pieces that set them up for failure in ways that is very hard to come back from.
Well, this is such an important conversation, and I know there's a lot more coming in the next few days. But let me just say thank you to the three of you. What an important conversation that you each are going to be leading in many different ways. And just say I take away sort of 3 super important things. One, just make sustained investment in schools an important piece of the conversation, because that sustained conversation matters. Include parents in asking for solutions, because every parent, and Jessica, I know you talked about this beforehand, but every parent cares about what's happening to their children and their schools, and there's a trust between schools and parents that is being lost that I hear from you. And then, Zeph, I think your point about just investing in teachers and then making sure those teachers stay in those schools matters, because if we want to see long-term outcomes, that's good. I know there was a lot more said here, but I think there is a big debate coming, and I will say I refrained myself from asking you all one important question after today's news of who do you endorse, but I will stay away from that conversation, only because I do think it's easy to get into the politics, but understanding how we actually solve the problem is actually a bigger question that we should be focused on. So thank you, and good luck with the rest of the convention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.